All right, friends. I'm going to invite you this morning, as we start, to think back to a time that everyone in this room lived through, because we're thinking back to 6 years ago, December 2019. Okay? If you're trying to locate what was happening in December 2019, Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus had both recently launched. Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, came out in theaters in December 2019. Donald Trump was finishing the third year of his first term. On December 18th, the House voted to bring articles of impeachment against him for the first time after details came out about a call between him and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. At the same time, the nation was looking towards the start of another election year. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden were all leading the polls in 2019, December, for who might win the upcoming primary. And of course, we each had our own private set of experiences, right? So like for me at that time, I was in the heart of the school age era. I had kids in 2nd, 4th, and 8th grade. My eldest, Elliot, was making plans for their big 8th grade trip to Yosemite. I'm pretty sure we went to the planning meeting in December 2018 because that was coming that spring. And Haven was in the midst of a season of growth. We'd been joined by a number of households who had come to us after their church had closed that year, as well as several others who had just found their way to us that year. Some of you are still in this room. We'd had a beautiful, powerful time at our fall retreat. That was the one that culminated in my ordination ceremony, for those of you who remember. That was powerful, right? That one was up there. New leaders were emerging and stepping up to initiate and lead new projects. There was great anticipation for where everything was going to go the following year. But of course, the year that followed was not like any of us expected, right? Elliot never went on that Yosemite trip. Most of the primary and election season ended up happening through a series of virtual events. Disney and Apple made a lot of money on their streaming services because, of course, within a few months of 2020, the world was stuck inside, trying to flatten the curve as the COVID-19 pandemic upended pretty much everything. Now, I don't bring this all up to just re-traumatize us all by reliving how disruptive that year was, how much it took us by surprise. But I bring it up because I think it's an example that we all can relate to of the kind of challenge that everyone has to navigate from time to time. Like, what do we do when our plans and our expectations are just upended? How do we move forward when things aren't working out the way we really thought they would? As people of faith, we may even wonder, where is God when life seems to take a left turn? I use this example of the global pandemic we all lived through because it's a collective experience of life taking a left turn that all of us in some way experienced, but it's probably not the only time any of us have had to contend with things not playing out the way we'd hoped or expected. Well, I'm naming all of this knowing today is the second Sunday of Advent. You can see we have our lovely Advent wreath, our candle that we lit for those of you who are in the Zoom last weekend together, already burning. And in case you're not very familiar, Advent is the traditional 4-week season of preparation that the church often observes leading up to the celebration of Christmas. At Christmas, we celebrate the birth of Jesus, the sacred reality it points to of God entering our world in a powerful way. In Advent, we connect with all the ways we still need God's presence to enter in and shift our reality now. And this year, as I think you know, we're working with this set of creative resources for reflection that comes from the folks at A Sanctified Art. We have more devotionals in the back. If you didn't get one a couple weeks ago and you're still interested, please take one. And the title of the series this year is, What Do You Fear? and then insisting on hope this Advent. This title itself points to the challenging but profound dialectic that takes place between fear and hope. Now, hope isn't the same thing as, say, optimism. It's not a confident sense things are going to go well. Hope can persist even in the midst of grief and disappointment, and yes, fear. The stories around the coming of Jesus actually reveal that reality because Jesus didn't come into a time and place that was particularly optimistic. But he did come in a way that brought hope to a world marked by injustice, sorrow, and fear. There's something else about hope that I'd like to invite us to consider today. Hope, I would suggest, isn't just a feeling. It's also a practice. It's a practice. And as such, hope can be practiced even when we're not in touch with the feeling at all. Hope can be practiced in the hard. Hope in the hard. So if you followed along in our resources or joined us last week at our Zoom, you know that last week we reflected on a very traditional Advent story. It was the story that's found in the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke, the story of an encounter that a priest named Zechariah had while serving in the temple in Jerusalem. And while he was there, an angel encountered Zechariah and shared the shocking news that this old man and his wife, who had been long unable to have any children, were finally going to have a son in their elder years. And the angel declared this couple would call their son John, and named that he would be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth, and he would, quote, go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, bringing back many of the people of Israel to God in preparation for the Messiah. So that was the story that was kind of centered last week. Today we're looking at a less traditional Advent story that takes place about 30 years later in the narrative, but it's centered on this same predicted baby who's now indeed grown into a powerful prophetic man that we call John the Baptist. And for this story, we're turning to the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew, thus far, if we had been reading the narrative up to chapter 11, where we're going to read our story, we would have seen Matthew's been following John's career as a prophet. He's been showing us his fiery preaching in the desert, which did indeed draw many people from throughout Judea to come and reconnect with the divine. We're told that John spoke of one coming who was more powerful even than himself, one whose sandals he said he was not worthy to carry. Matthew described the day Jesus himself came and came to be baptized by John, and John tried to stop him, claiming he was the one who actually needed Jesus' baptism, but Jesus insisted, no, this is how it needs to be. And when he went into the water and John baptized him, the heavens opened and the Spirit of God descended on Jesus like a dove. But sometime after that, things took a turn for John the Baptist. His notoriety as a prophet came to the attention of the ruler of the region, a cruel and tyrannical king named Herod Antipas, who is the son of Herod the Great, which was another tyrant king who was king when both John and Jesus were born. So the story we talked about last week, the nativity stories take place during the reign of Herod the Great. But now, 30 years later, Herod Antipas, his son, is the one in charge. And this Herod hears that John has been preaching against the morality of his current marriage, not his first marriage. And he uses that prophetic critique as a pretext to arrest John. And Herod locks him up in prison for speaking ill of his marriage. And it's in the midst of this unjust imprisonment that our story takes place. So we pick things up in Matthew 11, beginning with verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and proclaim his message in their cities. And when John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those with a skin disease are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." So here we encounter this great John the Baptist. But in our story, he's clearly not feeling so great. And it's understandable why. John has been doing the thing he knows he was tasked to do. I mean, it's the thing even his parents knew he was tasked to do from the day that angel came and met his dad, right? He's been doing this forcefully, preaching prophetically, calling people to turn from their sins. And he's done it believing fervently, knowing in his bones this was the task he'd been given by God. There's a freaking angel that announced it, right? Like, how more clear could it be that he was meant to prepare the way for the one coming after him, the one he believed to be Jesus? But now, his fiery preaching against sin has landed him in prison. It turns out, the politically powerful in his time don't actually appreciate John calling out their problematic behavior. So they punished him for it. They cut him off from the movement that he had ignited just as it's really getting going. And now, cut off from that movement, alone in his prison cell, John has questions. And John's questions aren't just like fact-finding queries. They are existential questions. Well, who is this Jesus he's hearing the reports about? Is he really who John thought he was supposed to be? Like, John's whole life has been in fulfillment of this task, to prepare the way for God's anointed one, the Messiah. He thought that was Jesus, but if John had it right and he was living in alignment with God's purposes for his life, why is he stuck behind bars? Did he get it wrong? Were all his efforts a waste? This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. Throughout those long months of 2020, I think many of us felt a similar kind of confusion, bewilderment, maybe even sense of betrayal, as we were stuck alone in our houses and apartments, cut off from all the activities we had expected that year. Here at Haven, our plans for exciting new initiatives turned into survival strategies amidst Zoom Sunday services. A number of the folks who were ready to step into more clear leadership roles in late 2019 stopped coming altogether. Did we get it wrong? This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. Many of us in the last year have likely felt a similar sense of disappointment, discouragement, rage even, as we've seen the struggles, say, for justice, for immigrants, for trans siblings, for Black folks, all set back. Rights and freedoms that were hard to win have been easy to strip away again. Institutions we thought were solid and strong are letting us down. We've attended protests, we've phone banked, we've given our time and our money, and yet things seem to be going backwards. Have all our efforts to make a more inclusive, just world just been futile? This isn't the way it's supposed to go. As much as we hate to admit it, living in this broken, unjust, fragile world includes for all of us these moments that undo us, moments that do not go the way they're supposed to. And in those moments, disappointment can harden into cynicism. And cynicism can isolate us into despair. And John is in that hard kind of place in this story. But as he shows us, in that space, there is an invitation to the practice of hope that I think John himself is taking, even from his own desperate perch on despair's edge. And I think it looks like this. Amidst the isolation of discouragement, reaching out is an embodied practice of hope. Does that make sense? Amidst the isolation of discouragement, reaching out is an embodied practice of hope. John could have stayed alone in his questions. He could have stewed in his discouragement, watched his fervent faith sour into cynical bitterness. But he didn't do that. In the midst of his grief and the fear that somehow he got it all wrong, John makes a choice. He reaches out. He sends word from his cell to some of his followers. They come. He asks them, go, find Jesus. Ask him the question that was burning on his heart. Are you the one? And this question to Jesus, as honest as in its uncertainty, some would say it's doubtful, but it's honest. And it's also an act of hope. Because even in acting, even in asking, John's acknowledging maybe, just maybe, Jesus has something John could use right now. Maybe, just maybe, light could still be found amidst all the darkness. John's desperate choice to reach out in his moment of suffering is an Advent invitation to us as well. When we're in our own spaces of discouragement, we might not be able to imagine what could be grasped if we could extend our hand in outreach. But just the act of reaching out to another person for help or reaching out to God in prayer, that is itself a practice of hope. By choosing to reach out, choosing to tell God or tell somebody else, I need something from you. Choosing to even just say, I need you to know I'm not okay. Those are embodiments of hope because they are activities that create at least the possibility for something else to come next, right? Reaching out to another and being honest about the discouragement makes room for a real encounter to happen. And with encounter comes the opportunity for something new to take place. For John, his outreach to Jesus brings revelation. Jesus sends a message back. It's probably not the message John had hoped to receive or was expecting. Jesus doesn't tell John he's about to come rescue him. He doesn't send word that, yes, of course, verified. Jesus is definitely the Messiah, and he's about to liberate the Jewish people in all the ways that John and others assumed the Messiah would. He doesn't speak of forcefully rebuking the Roman occupiers, dealing harshly with the wicked political figures who have John trapped in a prison cell. Instead, he points indirectly to the beautiful Subtly transformative things happening around Jesus. Tell John what you hear and see. Things like the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the poor have good news brought to them. These are signs of new life, even as the decaying old system is still standing. They invite John and his friends to use their senses, to observe, to notice transformation slowly happening around them, even if it isn't coming the way they expected, even while John remains in prison, even when Herod is going to cruelly take his life days later. The darkness of John's personal circumstance doesn't black out the light that is breaking in through these miraculous signs of God's presence and grace at work. Jesus' words to John hearkened back to many of the words of the prophet Isaiah, a prophet that both John and Jesus would have known really well. These prophetic words spoke of a time when justice would come, and with it, God would bring healing and liberation. I'll just read you a few. There's many more passages that resonate with the words that Jesus was naming to John. But these are just some of them. In Isaiah 21, we have, "On that day the deaf shall hear the words of a scroll, and freed from gloom and darkness, the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the neediest people shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. For the tyrant shall be no more, and the scoffer shall cease to be. All those alert to do evil shall be cut off." Or what about Isaiah 35? "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be opened, and the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy, for waters shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert." Or perhaps a few chapters later in Isaiah 43, pointing the faithful to observe something new that God will be doing. "I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert, and the wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people who I formed for myself, so they might declare my praise." All of these passages are words of encouragement and hope about noticing a new reality breaking in. And these words echoed from another time of deep collective trauma in John and Jesus' shared sacred history. They were from another season where the world was not as it should have been, because these words I just read came from the prophet Isaiah during the exile in Babylon. They came from the time in this people's history when those who had survived the destruction of their temple and their holy city were forced to leave their land and make a home elsewhere. And in that time, the prophet spoke to those who grieved and were discouraged about a new movement of God that would come and bring freedom to them. And Isaiah had used these images of transformation to demonstrate God's forthcoming liberating activity. And now, in the same way, by calling upon that history, while framing his own work, Jesus was telling John everything he needed to know. He was showing him that the same God who spoke hope to the exiles in Babylon, the same God who brought deliverance to them then, was still present and was bringing deliverance today. No, it wasn't perhaps the dramatic revolution that John expected. This revolution was quieter, subtler, more evident in experiences of grace and gentle transformation than coercion and violent retribution. But for those paying attention, the evidence was there that God was indeed doing a new thing that would bring freedom and life, like that spring flowing in the desert Amen. And that brings me to the other practice of hope in the hard that I think our Advent story reveals. It's the practice Jesus encourages John to practice. We practice hope by widening our scope of perception and noticing the surprising signs of divine grace. We practice hope by widening our scope of perception and noticing the surprising signs of divine grace. Jesus' invitation to John is an invitation to pay attention and perceive something he's missing. Jesus made these kind of invitations frequently. Those of you who have ears to hear, let them hear, he would say, a lot, right? That's not a phrase, I think, about physical ability. It's about spiritual perception. In the same way, Jesus is telling John's followers, tell Jesus what you hear and what you see. And then so many of the transformations he's pointing to, these healing events, are actually transformations that can alter someone's perception, right? The recovery of sight, the recovery of hearing. He talks about those who have leprosy. The condition that was called leprosy is the loss of the sense of touch. People are no longer able to perceive, to feel things physically. And yet Jesus is talking about a recovery of sensation. Perhaps Jesus is pointing to these kinds of miracles. It's less about these physical changes that come in these healing encounters and more about the changes of capacity to perceive God's presence, even in the midst of hard circumstances. That Jesus is calling John and us into a practice of hope that widens our scope of perception and allows us to notice the activity of God in our midst. No doubt, all of us can remember things we lost during the COVID years, the ways our lives were disrupted. But looking back and widening our view, where might we also notice signs of grace? Thinking back to 2020, I remember the grief and frustration I felt being stuck at home, separated from so many friends, my kids forced to do elementary school over a screen. It was terrible. It was so rough. But I also remember sweet ways we showed up for each other over Zoom, ways we adapted, created new rituals. In 2020, my family played a lot of Jackbox games. These online group games, you remember these? Allowed personal interaction like a board game, but without the need to be in physical space together. We played them with our relatives. We played them with our Haven friends. Our kids had virtual play dates with their classmates. By 2022, everyone was over the Jackbox game thing, grateful to move on to more in-person modes of connection. And yet, this year, my kids remembered that season, and we've brought some of those games back as our eldest moved across the country for college. And the teens have wanted to find a fun way, again, to connect across physical distance. That's a bit of grace that came to us from COVID. Years after 2020, I find myself grateful for those experiences of grace in that challenging season, the experiences of adapting, our friendships, experiences of personal growth. I'm grateful for the experiences many of us had across the country in a historic way, uniting with a mass movement of others to show up for racial justice, as so many people did that year after the tragic death of George Floyd. And when I think back to our experience over Sunday morning Zooms here at Haven and virtual game nights and other ways we connected and tried to build community through the pandemic, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all the people God brought into our community for that season, even if some of them have moved on afterwards. because their unique contributions in that time were a part of carrying us through it and revealing God to us in that hard season when we really needed it. We exist today because of what that season was. We are still here because of it. Building into the future because folks were here to sustain us through that trying time. That is grace. This last year, despite its challenges, has also been one of new spaces of grace revealed. I see it in the way my teens are developing their own thoughts and ethics, around convictions, around justice issues. These threats to trans rights and immigrant rights and racial justice help them realize what they really value and want to fight for as they grow into adulthood. That's encouraging. I see the gift of new alliances, like this interfaith work in which I've become so involved, standing up for our immigrant neighbors. And in those spaces, I see the impact of our solidarity on those who are suffering the most harm. We might not be able to stop the deportation machine, but our ongoing daily efforts to frustrate it, to slow it down, and also to care for those who are being harmed by it, testify to God's work among us, to the people who really need that testimony the most. I see the signs of God's grace here in this little community as folks step hopefully into new things, leading a new small group, teaching, leading an experience at our retreat, saying yes to some new project here at Haven. All of these are signs of a new thing God is doing that goes beyond this present moment. And those signs remind us that when hope widens our perspective, it opens us up not just to see the things happening in the present moment, but it also helps us to take a longer view and perceive God's work continuing into the future. John wasn't ever released from prison. Just days after he received that message back from Jesus, the violent, unjust state took his life, as it eventually would take Jesus's. It wasn't the end I think John had been imagining, but I'd like to believe that Jesus' words gave him the encouragement he needed as he perished, to know that his life and his work were not futile. They were a vital part of God's kingdom coming. Think of the words Jesus used to praise John the Baptist at the end of our passage, right? John was the one who did make the path in the wilderness so that grace could flow. And we are still walking that path John helped make all these centuries later. Every one of us. All of us are signs of grace, just as much as the signs Jesus told John about in their time. I want to end this morning with a poem that comes from the Brazilian poet, pastor, and liberation theologian Rubem Alves. Rubem knew what it meant to live under trying times. As a young clergyman, he had to flee his country of Brazil for a season amidst a U.S.-sponsored military coup because he was being unfairly accused of subversive communist activities. But Rubem also understood what it meant to have a wider scope of perception and a hope that was future-oriented. So I'm ending with his words and praying that they may be words of encouragement for us too, as we seek to practice hope, even in the hard, this Advent and beyond. The poem is called Tomorrow's Child. What is hope? It is a presentiment that imagination is more real and reality less real than it looks. It is a hunch that the overwhelming brutality of facts that oppress and repress is not the last word. It is a suspicion that reality is more complex than realism wants us to believe. and that the frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual, and that in a miraculous and unexpected way, life is preparing the creative events which will open the way to freedom and resurrection. The two, suffering and hope, live from each other. Suffering without hope produces resentment and despair. Hope without suffering creates illusions, naivete, and drunkenness. Let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. This is the secret discipline. It is a refusal to let the creative act be dissolved in immediate sense experience, and a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. Such disciplined love is what has given prophets, revolutionaries, and saints the courage to die for the future they envisaged. They make their own bodies the seed of their highest hopes. May we all grow practicing that kind of future-forward, disciplined hope. Amen. Let me pray for us, and then we'll move into our discussion. God, we acknowledge our discouragements. We resonate in each of us in our own ways with John's desperate cry. Are you the one? Or did we miss it? Are we supposed to be following another? God, I pray that in the same way you helped open John's perception, capacity to perceive your grace at work, you would do the same for us. Would you help us notice your presence here and now among us, your presence in the past, even when it felt bleak, and your ongoing activity into the future. When we feel that discouragement, may we continue in the practice of reaching out, not allowing ourselves to go deeper into isolation and despair. Thank you for meeting us when we extend our hands and our hearts. Would you continue to meet us this Advent season? Amen. All right, friends. So we'll go ahead and go into conversation for about 10 minutes. Here's a few prompts. The first is think of an experience in your life where things didn't go the way you thought they were supposed to. And how did you respond? And how do you think that experience impacted your capacity for hope? Or number 2, in times of discouragement, do you find it challenging to reach out to others and or to God? If so, why do you think that is? What about the experience is difficult? Or finally, when you widen your scope of perception, what signs of grace do you notice, either in your past, your present, or both? And how might those impact your hope for the future? Okay, so a lot to reflect on. We'll just chat for 10 minutes about whatever feels resonant for you. And then we'll return for candle lighting, worship, communion.